In this video we're going to be painting a tree late in the day where the tree is sort of silhouetted against a sunset sky. This particular tree is an Australian eucalypt. I'm going to start with a simple drawing. I'm going to have a very low position for the ground. I'll throw in some rocks here, and then we're going to have this tree coming up near the middle. I'm not going to put any more drawing here. I've really just indicated where the trunk's going to go, some rocks, and the size of the ground. When I paint this, I'm going to paint the foliage first and then paint the trunks. And when I'm painting the foliage, I'm really just interested in the particular pattern of the foliage with very little detail. To help me paint longer without having to worry too much about the painting drying too fast, I'm going to wet the back of the paper, but I'm going to leave the front dry. I'll just get a big brush, load it up with plenty of water, and painting close to the edge. I don't want to get the front of the paper wet if I can avoid it. So that's one wash. I'll come back and add a little bit more at the top. There's plenty of water at the bottom, but the top, the water disperses very quickly. And we'll let that sit there for a bit. While that's sitting there, we'll work on the colors we want. I've got a cool sunset, so there'll be violet leading into a warmer pinkish violet, leading down into some orange. Now, even though this is a sunset scene, the sky is almost always the lightest part of the painting, unless you're doing a nocturnal scene. So in this case, some cobalt blue. To which I'll add a small amount of permanent rose, with just a tiny bit of burnt sienna just to grey that off a bit so it's not too bright. And that's pretty good. And then this will move into permanent rose. It's not going to be a bright pink, and a lot of these two colours will merge together, but for the time being I'm just going to have permanent rose, a little bit of cobalt blue, and they'll flow into each other quite well. Here just some cad orange, very weak, and this makes for quite a nice sunset. This time I don't want the cad orange to be too bright, so I don't mind if these other two colours flow into it. And then for the ground, I'll just mix a small puddle of that. I'm going to start with some raw umber. And I'll add a little bit of burnt sienna to that. And again, because it's late in the day, it's not going to be very bright colour, so I'm going to add some French ultramarine to dull it off. Maybe a bit more burnt sienna. Because there's a little pink in the sky, I'm going to add some permanent rose to the mixture as well. Because this colour in the sky will shine down on the ground and modify that colour. And you can spend as much time as you want getting ready to paint. With me, I quite often spend a lot of time getting ready to paint, and then I paint very quickly. Now, this has been absorbing moisture. You can see how the paper can absorb more water as it's still cockled. So I'm going to go over the top of that once more. This is quite a big mop style brush. It holds a lot of water, so I don't need to keep picking up a lot of water. That would probably do that. And I'll just lift it. Now I'll wet my board. My material is Gator board, which is made from 2 thin veneers of semi-waterproof wood fibre on either side of foam core. Because it absorbs some of the water, it helps keep the back of my paper wet for longer. If you don't have any foam core, any waterproof backing board should do for this exercise. Then we'll get rid of all this excess water from around the edge. And this will give me a very flat surface to paint on, and I don't even need to worry about taping it. So this is a size 16 brush. I quite often use my size 12. In fact, I'll be using both of them. So this is about 1.5 inches of hair. This one's probably 1.75 inches, but a much thicker brush, so it holds a lot more paint. Okay, so I'm going to start at the top, give the paint a quick swirl. And you want enough paint on your brush that you can see the paint flow down the paper. I'm going to go straight into the pink while that's flowing. There. Maybe a bit more pink. Cad orange, and already the two are mixing together. I'm going to pick up some more cad orange, just a little bit brighter down below. And I want those colours to gently flow into one another. I'll just lift this a bit to increase that merging. In a normal sky you get quite a nice even gradation. And now I'll paint in the ground. And you can see how the paint from up here is flowing down and lightening that distant ridge. And normally that's what I want if that was the ground, but this time I don't want it to lighten that too much, because that ridge is going to be one of the darkest areas of my painting. There. And then, just to make this area look a bit more interesting, I'll get my size 8 brush, maybe add some turquoise into this mix. Just splatter a little bit of paint there. More burnt sienna. I'll add a little bit of Scarlet Lake as well to warm it up some more. And we'll let those colours flow. I decided to add some tracks along the hill. Just drizzled some extra water in there. I didn't like these tracks being too regular looking. There we go. And that'll do. So we've done our sky, we've done our ground. Now I just let that dry and we'll paint the tree. Just make sure there's no excess moisture around the edge, or that can flow back in and give us cauliflowers along the edge here. and I'll go and dry that with a hairdryer just to speed things up. Okay, I'll now paint the foliage, and while the foliage is wet, I'll paint the trunks and the branches. This gives me a nice natural connection between the branches, trunks and the foliage. You don't always have to paint the foliage first. It's not a hard and fast rule. I'll pick up my size 12 brush, and for the foliage here I want a dull grey-green colour, and I could possibly mix it into this leftover sky colour by adding some aureolin, some cobalt turquoise and some raw umber. You could use Winsor lemon instead of the aureolin if you prefer. I added some French ultramarine to darken and cool the colour. So primarily this is French ultramarine and raw umber. There's also a little bit of aureolin and cobalt turquoise in the mix, but it's not so critical in this case. And I'll pick up my paint, drag the brush through the edge of the palette to remove about half the moisture. You don't want this to be fully loaded at this stage, so that you can get some nice dry brush effects happening. My brush is still a little too wet, so I lightly tap it on my towel to take some more paint out of it. And barely touching the paper. And I'll leave plenty of gaps or bird holes in the foliage. I can always fill them in later, but once they're gone, they're hard to get back. I look for an interesting pattern. And then for the trunk, primarily burnt sienna and a little bit of French ultramarine. And I've used the leftover ground colour here, so that had a little bit of Scarlet Lake in it, a little bit of pink, a little bit of raw umber. And mixing them all together give us just a cool brown colour. And by painting this while the foliage is wet, some of the paint flows into the foliage and gives me a better connection. It doesn't look like I've just painted right up to an edge. That'll do. I'll now grab my rigger brush, just a very fine brush, and put in some of these thinner branches. painting this very quickly because I want to go back into some of the foliage and make it darker. So just drag the brush forward, pull it back a little bit and then change its direction. There we go. I can add more branches in a minute if I want. And I'm going to pick up a smaller brush, my size 8. And I'll add a bit more French ultramarine to this, a bit more rock umber. Again, making sure I don't lose all my bird holes. And I have to do it before the other green dries so that I don't end up with a muddy, non-translucent layer. Which happens when you're painting into damp paint and while your skill is still being developed. So this gives me some lighter tones and some darker tones just to make the foliage a little bit more interesting. And also, if you look at the photo, you'll see that the foliage has some of the darkest areas in this scene. Great, and I'm happy with that. Now we'll just work on the ground. And I'm going to throw in some rocks here. The ground has to be made darker because the contrast between the ground and the sky is greater than what I already have. I'm going to pick up a bigger brush. And I'm going to make these rocks just a bit darker still. Just some burnt sienna, French ultramarine, a little bit of Scarlet Lake. There we go. And underneath some of these little highlights, we'll just throw a dark shape. Turn them into rocks. There's more here. Just a bit more splatter. Then I'll get my fan brush. This is just a cheap hog hair fan brush. I think I paid about $20 Australian for a set of 6. And I'll just use that to throw up a few grasses around here. you're not going to see a lot of detail down in this area because of the lateness of the day. Before I finish this, I'm going to adjust the base of the trunk. Quite often these trees are darker down there, so I'm going to just flick some brush strokes up that way. If this was wider, you could throw in some other trees, but I'm happy with this as a simple landscape. There we go. Now, once this dries, I'll sign it and the painting will be finished.